12-year-old David pressed his face against the cool window of the city bus, feeling the vibrations of the engine beneath his feet. He couldn't see the towering buildings rushing past, but he could hear the symphony of the city. Car horns honked in rhythm with pedestrian chatter, creating a melody that most people never noticed. For David, who had been blind since birth, sound was everything. His music teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, sat beside him, occasionally pointing out landmarks he couldn't see, but describing them in ways that painted pictures in his mind. "There's the fountain with the dancing water jets," she said softly. "And that tall building with the curved glass? That's where they hold the summer jazz festivals." David smiled and nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Today was the day he'd been dreaming about for months. They were heading to Lincoln Hall, the most prestigious concert venue in the city, where the famous pianist Alexander Volkov was giving a masterclass. Mrs. Rodriguez had somehow managed to get them tickets, though David suspected she'd spent her own money to make it happen. The bus lurched to a stop, and Mrs. Rodriguez gently touched his arm. "This is us, David. Are you ready?" David's heart hammered against his ribs as he stood up, gripping his white cane. He'd been playing piano for 8 years, ever since his grandmother had bought him a small keyboard from a pawn shop. What started as a way to keep a restless child occupied had quickly turned into something magical. David's fingers seemed to know where every key lived, and music flowed from him like water from a spring. But this was different. This wasn't his neighborhood community center or his school's cramped music room. This was Lincoln Hall, where the greatest musicians in the world performed. As they walked toward the entrance, David could hear the change in the sounds around them. The street noise faded, replaced by the rustle of expensive clothing and the soft murmur of cultured voices. He caught snippets of conversations about techniques and composers, words spoken with the confidence of people who belonged in this world. The acoustics in the main hall are absolutely divine, a woman's voice drifted past them. "I heard Volkov is quite demanding in his master classes," a man responded. "He doesn't suffer fools gladly." David's stomach twisted. He wasn't even supposed to be here. Mrs. Rodriguez had entered his name in a lottery for young musicians, never expecting him to actually win a spot. When the call came, David had been practicing at the old upright piano in his family's small apartment, the same piano that was missing 3 keys and desperately needed tuning. The entrance to Lincoln Hall was a wall of sound. Conversations echoed off high ceilings, footsteps clicked on marble floors, and somewhere in the distance, David could hear the faint sound of someone warming up on a piano. The notes were crystal clear, each one perfectly placed. Nothing like the muffled sounds that came from his instrument at home. Mrs. Rodriguez guided him through the lobby, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "The ceiling here is painted with scenes from famous operas," she whispered. "And there are crystal chandeliers that catch the light like frozen fireworks." David tried to imagine it, but he was more interested in the sounds. The way voices carried differently in this space, how footsteps seemed to dance rather than simply walk. This building was built for music, and he could feel it in every surface. They found their seats in the main hall, and David ran his hands along the plush velvet armrests. Everything here was soft and expensive, so different from the folding chairs and bare floors of the places where he usually played. The seat next to him creaked as Mrs. Rodriguez settled in. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. "Like I'm dreaming," David admitted. "Like I might wake up and be back in my bedroom." Around them, the hall continued to fill with people. David listened to their conversations, picking up fragments about musical theory and performance techniques. These weren't casual music lovers. These were serious musicians, students from the city's top conservatories, and professionals who made their living with their instruments. A hush fell over the crowd, and David heard the unmistakable sound of dress shoes walking across a wooden stage. The footsteps were confident, measured, and somehow commanding even before their owner spoke a word. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen." The voice that filled the hall was rich and cultured, with just a hint of an accent that David couldn't quite place. "I am Alexander Volkov, and today we will explore what separates merely playing notes from creating true music." David had heard recordings of Volkov's performances, but hearing him speak in person was different. There was an authority in his voice, a certainty that came from years of standing on the world's greatest stages. This was someone who had performed in concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo, who had played for presidents and kings. Music is not about moving your fingers quickly, Volkov continued, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. It is about understanding the soul of what you play. It is about telling a story that words cannot express. David leaned forward in his seat, hanging on every word. This was why he was here, not just to listen to beautiful music, but to learn from someone who truly understood what music could be. Volkov spent the next hour working with 3 advanced students, each one more accomplished than David could imagine being. He listened as the master teacher guided them through pieces by Chopin and Rachmaninoff, pointing out subtle details that transformed good playing into something transcendent. You see, Volkov explained to one student, you are playing the notes correctly, but you are not playing the silence between them. The pauses are just as important as the sounds. David understood exactly what he meant. In his own playing, he had discovered that the moments of quiet were when the music breathed, when it became alive rather than just a series of sounds. As the formal masterclass portion ended, David noticed that some people were beginning to leave, but many were staying for what Mrs. Rodriguez had told him was an informal question and answer session. This was his chance to get closer to the stage to maybe even ask a question of his own. Mrs. Rodriguez helped him navigate to a seat closer to the front, where he could hear Volkov's voice more clearly. The great pianist was answering questions about his training, his influences, and his approach to different composers. Music chose me before I chose it, Volkov was saying in response to a question about when he knew he wanted to be a professional musician. I believe we all have something inside us that responds to beauty, but for some of us that response becomes our life's work. David felt those words settle deep in his chest. He had never thought about it quite that way, but it was true. Music hadn't been something he decided to pursue. It had been something that found him, something that felt as natural as breathing. The session was winding down when Mrs. Rodriguez leaned over and whispered, "Would you like to go see the piano up close? Sometimes they let people look at it after these events." David's pulse quickened. The idea of being near the same instrument that Volkov had just played, of maybe even touching those keys, was almost too exciting to bear. He nodded eagerly, and together they made their way toward the stage as the crowd began to thin out. The stage of Lincoln Hall felt like stepping into another world. David's cane tapped softly against the polished wood as Mrs. Rodriguez guided him toward the magnificent grand piano that dominated the center of the platform. Even from several feet away, he could sense its presence. This wasn't like the old upright at home with its yellowed keys and tired strings. This instrument seemed to hum with potential, waiting for the right hands to bring it to life. "It's a Steinway Model D," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, her voice filled with reverence. 9 feet long and probably worth more than most people's houses. David reached out tentatively, his fingertips barely grazing the smooth black surface. The wood was cool and flawless, polished to a mirror shine that he couldn't see but could feel. Everything about this piano spoke of perfection, of music at its highest level. A few other people had also stayed behind to admire the instrument. David could hear their hushed conversations, mostly students from the conservatory discussing techniques they'd observed during the master class. He felt somewhat out of place among them, knowing they had formal training he could never afford. But the pull of the piano was too strong to resist. Mrs. Rodriguez had stepped away to speak with one of the hall's staff members about something, leaving David alone near the piano. He was running his hand along the edge of the keyboard cover when he heard footsteps approaching. Heavy, confident steps that seemed to expect the world to move out of their way. "Excuse me, young man." The voice was cultured and sharp, with that same slight accent David had noticed during the master class. His heart nearly stopped. Alexander Volkov was speaking directly to him. David turned toward the voice, his hands immediately moving to a respectful position at his sides. "Yes, sir? What exactly do you think you're doing?" There was something in Volkov's tone that made David's stomach drop. The warmth and wisdom from the master class had been replaced by something colder, more impatient. "I was just... Mrs. Rodriguez said we could look at the piano," David stammered, suddenly feeling very young and very out of place. Volkov moved closer, and David could smell expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of rosin from violin bows and the particular mustiness that seemed to cling to old concert halls. "Look at the piano?" Volkov's voice carried a hint of amusement that didn't sound kind. "Tell me, child, exactly how does one such as yourself look at anything?" The words hit David like a physical blow. He felt his cheeks burn with sudden heat and his hands began to tremble slightly. Around them, he could sense that other people had noticed the interaction. Conversations died away, replaced by the uncomfortable silence of people witnessing something they weren't sure they should be seeing. I meant, David started, but Volkov cut him off. You meant you could listen to it? Touch it, perhaps? Volkov's voice was getting louder now, clearly intended for the small audience that had gathered. Tell me, boy, do you play piano? David nodded, not trusting his voice. How charming, Volkov continued, and David could hear the cruel smile in his words. And where did you study? Juilliard? The Curtis Institute? Perhaps the Royal Academy in London? I teach myself mostly, and Mrs. Rodriguez helps me sometimes. The silence that followed was deafening. David could practically feel the stares of the other people in the hall, could imagine their expressions of pity or embarrassment. He wanted nothing more than to disappear, to sink through the polished floor and wake up back in his own bedroom. Self-taught, Volkov repeated slowly, as if the words were foreign to him. How absolutely quaint. He paused, and David could hear him moving around the piano, probably gesturing to his impromptu audience. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here a perfect example of the democratization of music. Everyone believes they can be an artist, regardless of training, talent, or, he paused meaningfully, other obvious limitations. David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had faced cruel comments before. Kids at school who mocked his cane, strangers who spoke about him as if he couldn't hear them, people who assumed that because he couldn't see, he couldn't do anything else either. But this was different. This was someone he had admired, someone whose recordings he had listened to countless times, someone he had dreamed of meeting. The piano, Volkov continued, his voice taking on the tone of a lecture, is perhaps the most complex of all instruments. It requires years of rigorous training, an understanding of theory that goes far beyond simply pressing keys in sequence. It demands discipline, proper technique, and another meaningful pause, the ability to read the great works of the masters. David felt tears threatening behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people, and certainly not in front of this man who seemed to take pleasure in his humiliation. Perhaps, Volkov said, his voice now dripping with false kindness, you would be better suited to something more appropriate to your situation. A harmonica, perhaps? Or maybe percussion? After all, one doesn't need to see to bang on drums. The cruelty of the comment sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the small crowd. Even people who had been watching with detached interest seemed uncomfortable now. David heard someone clear their throat uncomfortably, and a woman's voice whispered, "That's enough," though not loudly enough for Volkov to hear. David stood frozen, his entire body trembling with a mixture of humiliation and rising anger. This was supposed to be one of the greatest days of his life. He had saved money from his part-time job helping at the local grocery store to buy the bus fare. He had dreamed for months about being in the same room as a master musician, about maybe learning something that would help him become better. Instead, he was being treated like a curiosity, an object lesson in why some people shouldn't dare to dream beyond their circumstances. Cat got your tongue, boy? Volkov pressed, clearly enjoying the power he held in this moment. Or perhaps you're beginning to understand that music is not for everyone, that there are certain prerequisites for true artistry? The words hung in the air like poison. David could feel the weight of every person's stare, could imagine their mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. Some part of him wanted to run, to grab Mrs. Rodriguez and flee this beautiful hall that had suddenly become the site of his worst nightmare. But another part of him, the part that had spent countless hours at his family's broken piano, the part that heard music in everything from rainfall to traffic patterns, that part was getting angry, not just hurt but genuinely angry. I may not be able to see, David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but I can hear when someone is being cruel just for the sake of it. Volkov laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Cruel? My dear child, I'm being educational. Music is not a charity case. It's not something we pretend everyone can do simply to make them feel better about themselves. David felt something shift inside him. The fear and embarrassment were still there, but they were being overwhelmed by something else. Something that had been building throughout his entire life every time someone told him what he couldn't do, what he shouldn't even try, what wasn't meant for people like him. You're right, David said, his voice growing stronger. Music isn't for everyone. It's for people who love it enough to find a way, no matter what stands in their path. Volkov's laughter died away, replaced by a cold silence. How profound, he said with heavy sarcasm. And I suppose you believe you're one of these special individuals? David lifted his chin, meeting Volkov's gaze even though he couldn't see it. Yes, sir. I do. The pianist moved closer and David could feel his presence like a storm cloud. Then perhaps you'd like to prove it, Volkov said, his voice low and dangerous. Perhaps you'd like to show all these nice people just exactly what your self-taught abilities can accomplish. David's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was the moment where he either backed down and confirmed everything Volkov believed about him, or stepped forward into something that could either vindicate him or destroy him completely. He thought about his grandmother, who had bought him that first keyboard even though money was tight. He thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who stayed after school to work with him even though she wasn't paid extra for it. He thought about all the hours he'd spent at that old piano, losing himself in music because it was the one place where being blind didn't matter, where he could be exactly who he was meant to be. Yes, sir, David said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. I would like that very much. The silence that followed David's acceptance stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. He could feel the weight of every person's attention pressing down on him, could sense their mixture of anticipation and discomfort. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard Mrs. Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath. She had returned just in time to witness the challenge being thrown down like a gauntlet. Alexander Volkov's footsteps circled around the piano, each step deliberate and measured. How delightful, he said, his voice carrying that same false warmth that made David's skin crawl. A performance. How absolutely entertaining this should be. David's hands trembled slightly at his sides, but he forced them to be still. He had committed himself now. There was no backing down, no graceful way to retreat. Around him, he could hear the subtle sounds of people positioning themselves for a better view. The soft rustle of clothing as they settled in to watch what many probably expected to be a spectacular failure. Tell me, young maestro, Volkov continued, the sarcasm thick in his voice. What shall you play for us? Perhaps Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? Or maybe you know Mary Had a Little Lamb. The cruel laughter that followed from a few members of the small audience cut through David like glass. He felt his cheeks burn with renewed humiliation, but underneath the embarrassment something else was building, a quiet determination that had carried him through years of being underestimated, of being told what he couldn't do. I thought I might play something I wrote, David said quietly. The laughter died away immediately. Even Volkov seemed momentarily taken aback by the response. Original composition wasn't what anyone had expected from a 12-year-old boy with a white cane and second-hand clothes. Something you wrote? Volkov repeated slowly. How ambitious. And what shall we call this masterpiece? David hesitated for a moment. He had never given the piece a formal title. It was something that had come to him during long nights at the piano, when the rest of his family was asleep and he could play softly without disturbing anyone. It was a piece born from his own experiences, his own struggles and triumphs. I call it Finding Light, he said finally. Volkov's sharp laugh echoed through the hall. How appropriately sentimental. Finding light, from someone who has never seen it. The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable now, and David heard several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. Mrs. Rodriguez took a step forward. Alexander, perhaps this isn't... Please, Volkov cut her off with a raised hand. Let the boy have his moment. After all, we wouldn't want to deny him his chance to shine. David made his way to the piano bench, his cane tapping softly against the stage floor. Each step felt monumental, as if he were walking toward the edge of a cliff. Behind him, he could hear whispered conversations, fragments of words like "poor kid" and "this is cruel" and "someone should stop this." But he didn't want anyone to stop it. This moment, terrifying as it was, felt like everything he had been building toward his entire life. Every hour at that old piano, every song he had taught himself by ear, every time he had chosen to keep playing despite the doubts and limitations others tried to place on him. It had all led to this. The piano bench was exactly the right height, and as David sat down, he felt some of his nervousness ease. This was familiar territory. His hands knew what to do here, even if his heart was racing and his palms were damp with sweat. He reached out and lifted the keyboard cover, revealing the pristine white and black keys beneath. Unlike his piano at home, these keys felt perfect under his fingertips. No sticky keys, no dead notes, no need to compensate for strings that had gone flat. This instrument was waiting to sing. "Take your time," Volkov called out from somewhere behind him, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "We're all very eager to hear what genius sounds like." David placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath. The hall around him faded away. The whispered conversations, the rustling of clothing, even Volkov's presence seemed to diminish. There was only him and the piano and the music that lived inside him, waiting to be born. He thought about the piece he was about to play. It had come to him in fragments over many months, usually late at night when the world was quiet and he could hear his own thoughts clearly. It started in a minor key, reflecting the loneliness and frustration he sometimes felt when the world seemed designed for people who could see. But it didn't stay dark. Gradually, it found its way to hope, to the moments of pure joy he experienced when music lifted him above his circumstances. The opening notes were soft, almost hesitant, like someone tentatively reaching out in the darkness. David's left hand established a gentle rolling bass line, while his right hand picked out a melody that seemed to question everything around it. This was the searching part, the part that asked why some dreams seemed impossible, and why some people had to fight harder for the same opportunities others took for granted. As the music developed, David felt the familiar sensation of becoming one with the instrument. His fingers knew exactly where to go, finding harmonies and progressions that seemed to emerge naturally from the keys themselves. This wasn't just playing notes in sequence, this was telling a story, painting pictures with sound, creating something that had never existed before this moment. Behind him, the whispered conversations had stopped entirely. The hall had fallen into complete silence except for the music flowing from the piano. David couldn't see the faces of his audience, but he could feel the change in the atmosphere. The mixture of anticipation and discomfort had transformed into something else. Attention, genuine listening, surprise. The piece began to shift, moving from the questioning minor sections into something brighter. David's hands danced across the keys as the melody found its confidence, as the bass line grew stronger and more assertive. This was the part of the music that spoke about discovery, about finding that place inside yourself where you belonged regardless of what the outside world tried to tell you. Volkov had gone completely silent. David couldn't hear him moving, couldn't sense the restless energy that had radiated from the famous pianist just moments before. Even Mrs. Rodriguez seemed to be holding her breath. The music continued to build, David's technique becoming more complex as the piece demanded it. His left hand played intricate patterns while his right hand soared through melodic lines that would have challenged much more experienced players. But this wasn't about showing off technical skill. This was about something deeper, something that came from a place where musical training mattered less than musical truth. As the piece moved toward its climax, David felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. Not tears of sadness or humiliation, but tears of pure release. Every emotion he had felt during Volkov's cruel taunts, every moment of doubt and fear and anger, was being transformed into something beautiful, something meaningful. The final section of the piece was triumphant without being boastful, confident without being arrogant. It spoke of finding your place in the world not because someone gave it to you, but because you claimed it through your own determination and talent. The melody lines wove together in complex harmonies that filled every corner of the great hall, reaching toward the painted ceiling and the crystal chandeliers that David couldn't see but could somehow feel. As he played the final phrase, David realized that he had never performed this piece so completely, so perfectly before. The Steinway had brought out nuances in his composition that his old piano at home could never have revealed. This instrument didn't just play the notes, it sang them. It made them live and breathe and dance. The last note rang out into the silence, sustained by the piano's perfect acoustics until it faded naturally into nothing. David kept his hands on the keys for a moment longer, reluctant to break the spell that had settled over the hall. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands and turned on the bench to face his audience. The silence was absolute. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. David sat perfectly still on the piano bench, his hands resting in his lap, waiting for some kind of response to the music that had just poured out of him. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, but no one seemed able to speak. Then, somewhere in the back of the hall, he heard it. A single pair of hands coming together in applause. Slow at first, tentative, as if the person wasn't sure they should be clapping. But then others joined in, and within seconds the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. David felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't polite, obligatory clapping. This was the kind of applause reserved for performances that truly moved people, that reached inside them and touched something they hadn't expected to feel. He could hear people calling out words of appreciation, could sense them rising to their feet. Extraordinary, someone shouted over the applause. Absolutely brilliant, called another voice. But through it all, David found himself listening for one voice in particular. Alexander Volkov had gone completely silent during the performance, and he remained silent now even as the applause continued to wash over the hall like waves. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at David's side, her hand gentle on his shoulder. He could hear the tears in her voice as she leaned down to whisper in his ear. "David, that was... I don't have words. In 20 years of teaching, I have never heard anything like that." The applause gradually began to die down, but David could still hear people talking excitedly among themselves. Fragments of conversation drifted to him across the stage. "Who is that boy? Did you hear that harmonic progression in the middle section? The emotional depth? It's incredible. He's just a child, how is that possible?" Slowly, David became aware of footsteps approaching the piano, heavy, measured steps that he recognized immediately. Alexander Volkov was walking toward him, and the hall fell silent once again as people realized what was happening. David turned his head toward the sound, his heart hammering. He had no idea what to expect. Would Volkov continue his cruel taunts? Would he dismiss the performance as a fluke? Would he find some way to diminish what had just happened? The footsteps stopped directly in front of the piano bench. David could sense Volkov's presence, could feel the intensity of the man's focus even though he couldn't see his expression. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was different now than it had been during the cruel exchange earlier. This silence was heavy with something David couldn't quite identify. Shock, perhaps, or confusion, or maybe even something approaching respect. When Volkov finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Where did that come from? David wasn't sure how to answer. How could he explain that the music came from the same place that helped him navigate a world designed for people who could see? How could he describe the way melodies appeared in his mind fully formed, as if they had been waiting there all along for him to find them? "I don't know, sir," he said honestly. "It just is." Volkov took a step closer. "That piece. You said you wrote it?" "Yes, sir." "All of it? The harmonic structure, the developmental sections, the way you built to the climax?" David nodded. "I work on it a little bit at a time. Sometimes when I'm practicing, new parts just come to me." There was another long pause. David could hear Volkov breathing, could sense the man struggling with something internal. "How long have you been playing?" Volkov asked finally. "About 8 years, sir. Since I was 4. "And you've never had formal training? No conservatory classes, no private instruction with master teachers?" "Mrs. Rodriguez helps me sometimes," David said, glancing toward his teacher. "But mostly I just play. I listen to recordings and try to figure out how they work. I practice as much as I can." David heard Volkov take a sharp intake of breath. "On what instrument?" "An old upright piano at home. It's missing some keys and it hasn't been tuned in a long time, but it's what we have." The silence that followed was different again. David could practically feel Volkov processing this information, trying to reconcile what he had just heard with what he thought he knew about musical education and talent development. "Ladies and gentlemen," Volkov said suddenly, his voice carrying across the hall to address the entire audience. "What we have just witnessed is..." He paused, seeming to search for words. "What we have just witnessed is why I became a musician in the first place." David felt a shiver run down his spine. The cruelty and sarcasm had completely disappeared from Volkov's voice, replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. "I have spent my entire career studying with the greatest teachers in the world," Volkov continued. "I have performed on the most prestigious stages, with the finest orchestras, playing instruments worth millions of dollars. I have dedicated my life to the pursuit of musical perfection." He paused, and David could hear him moving closer to the piano. But what this young man just shared with us cannot be taught in any conservatory. It cannot be learned from any textbook or masterclass. What he just played came from a place that is beyond technique, beyond training, beyond everything we usually associate with musical excellence. David felt tears beginning to form behind his eyes. But these were different tears than the ones that had threatened earlier. These were tears of relief, of validation, of finally being seen for who he really was rather than what people assumed he couldn't be. "David," Volkov said, and it was the first time the famous pianist had used his name. "I owe you an apology. A profound apology. What I said to you earlier was not just cruel, it was ignorant. I allowed my own prejudices and assumptions to blind me to something extraordinary." The hall was so quiet that David could hear individual people breathing. No one seemed willing to break the spell of what was happening. "I have been playing piano for 40 years, Volkov continued. "I have won international competitions, recorded with major labels, performed for heads of state. But I have never, not once in my entire career, heard a piece of music that moved me the way yours just did." David felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. This couldn't be real. Alexander Volkov, one of the greatest pianists alive, was not only apologizing to him but praising his music in front of a room full of people. "The composition you just played," Volkov said, "demonstrates an understanding of musical storytelling that most professional composers never achieve. The way you developed your themes, the sophistication of your harmonic language, the emotional arc of the entire piece, it's simply remarkable." Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed David's shoulder, and he could hear her crying softly behind him. "But more than that," Volkov continued, "you reminded me of something I had forgotten. Music is not about perfection. It's not about flawless technique or prestigious credentials. Music is about truth. It's about taking the deepest parts of human experience and transforming them into something beautiful, something that connects us all." David wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, overwhelmed by the complete reversal of everything that had happened earlier. "Your music, David, has that truth. It has an honesty and depth that comes from someone who has faced challenges and chosen to transform them into art, rather than bitterness. That is a gift that cannot be taught." Volkov stepped even closer, and David could sense the man kneeling down beside the piano bench so they were at the same level. "I would like to ask you something," Volkov said quietly. His voice meant only for David. "Would you be willing to let me help you? Not to change what you do, but to give you the tools and opportunities to share it with the world." David's voice caught in his throat. Yes, sir. I would like that very much." The applause that erupted then was even louder than before, but David barely heard it. All he could think about was how completely his life had just changed. How a day that had started with such hope and turned so dark had somehow become the most important day of his life. 6 months later, David stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The sounds of the audience settling into their seats filtered through the heavy curtains. 2,000 people who had come to hear him play. It still felt surreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. Mrs. Rodriguez stood beside him, smoothing down his formal concert jacket for the 3rd time. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. "Different," David replied honestly, "but good different." And he did feel different. The months since that transformative day at Lincoln Hall had been a whirlwind of change. True to his word, Alexander Volkov had immediately begun working to give David opportunities he never could have imagined. But more importantly, he had kept his promise not to change what made David's music special. The first thing Volkov had done was arrange for David to have access to a proper piano. Within a week of their encounter, a beautiful baby grand had appeared in David's family's apartment, donated by one of Volkov's wealthy patrons who had been moved by the story. David's mother had cried when she saw it, not just because of its beauty, but because of what it represented, a world opening up for her son that she had never dared to hope for. The lessons with Volkov had been unlike anything David had expected. Rather than drilling him on scales and technique, the master pianist had focused on helping David understand the broader context of music. They studied the great composers together, with Volkov describing not just how they wrote, but why they made the choices they did. They explored different musical traditions, from classical to jazz to folk music from around the world. "Your instincts are already perfect," Volkov had told him during one of their early sessions. "My job is not to change them, but to give you a bigger vocabulary to express them with. Most importantly, Volkov had encouraged David to keep composing. In the months since that first meeting, David had written dozens of new pieces, each one exploring different aspects of his experience and imagination. Some were dark and introspective, others bright and celebratory. All of them carried that same emotional honesty that had made Finding Light so powerful. Word of David's talent had spread quickly through the classical music world. Volkov had recorded their first session together and shared it with other musicians, who had been equally stunned by what they heard. Soon David was receiving invitations to perform at various venues, each one larger and more prestigious than the last. Tonight's concert at Carnegie Hall was the culmination of everything that had happened since that day at Lincoln Hall. The program consisted entirely of David's original compositions, pieces that told the story of his journey from that broken piano in his family's apartment to this moment standing in the wings of one of the world's most famous concert halls. Ladies and gentlemen, came the announcement over the hall's sound system. Please welcome composer and pianist David Chen. David made his way onto the stage, his cane tapping softly against the floor. The applause was warm and welcoming, but he could sense the curiosity in it as well. Many of these people had come because they'd heard rumors about a young blind composer, but they weren't sure what to expect. The piano waiting for him center stage was another Steinway Model D, similar to the one at Lincoln Hall, but somehow even more magnificent. As he settled onto the bench and placed his hands on the keys, David felt that familiar sense of coming home. This was where he belonged, where all the challenges and obstacles of his daily life fell away and only the music mattered. He began with Finding Light, the piece that had started everything. But this version was more developed, more sophisticated than what he had played that day at Lincoln Hall. The months of working with Volkov had given him new tools to express the emotions he had always felt, new ways to structure and develop his musical ideas. As the familiar opening notes filled the hall, David heard the audience settle into deep listening. This was a different kind of attention than he had experienced in smaller venues. 2,000 people breathing together, focusing together, experiencing the music as a collective entity. The piece unfolded exactly as David had always imagined it should, with each section flowing naturally into the next. The questioning, searching beginning gave way to moments of struggle and doubt, which then transformed into hope and finally into triumphant self-acceptance. When the final notes faded away, the silence that followed was absolute and reverent. Then the applause erupted, and David knew immediately that this was different from anything he had experienced before. This wasn't just appreciation, this was recognition. The audience understood that they had witnessed something special, something that would stay with them long after they left the hall. The rest of the concert passed in a blur of beautiful moments. David played pieces inspired by his neighborhood, by conversations with his grandmother, by the sounds of the city that had shaped his understanding of rhythm and melody. He played music that spoke about friendship and family, about the specific challenges of navigating the world without sight, and about the universal human experiences of hope and disappointment and joy. With each piece, David could feel the audience connecting more deeply with his music. These weren't just notes being played skillfully. These were stories being told, emotions being shared, experiences being translated into a language that everyone could understand, regardless of their background or circumstance. So when the formal program ended, the standing ovation seemed to go on forever. David could hear people calling out for encores, and he was happy to oblige. He played a piece he had written just the week before, inspired by a conversation he'd had with Volkov about the responsibility that comes with being able to move people through art. As the final encore ended, and David took his bow, he thought about how dramatically his life had changed since that day at Lincoln Hall. But more than that, he thought about all the young musicians who might be listening tonight, who might be struggling with their own challenges and obstacles, who might need to hear that it was possible to find your place in the world through sheer determination and love for your art. Backstage after the concert, David was surrounded by well-wishers and music industry professionals. Record label executives wanted to discuss recording contracts. Concert promoters were eager to book him for tours. Music critics were asking about his influences and his future plans. But the moment that meant the most came when a young girl approached him, guided by her parents. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and David could hear the tap of her own white cane as she walked. "Mr. David," she said in a small, clear voice, "I play piano too. My teacher says I should listen to your music because you show that people like us can do anything." David knelt down to her level, feeling tears forming in his eyes. "What's your name?" "Lily," she replied. "Well, Lily, your teacher is absolutely right. But more than that, I hope you write your own music too. The world needs to hear your stories, not just mine." As David stood up and listened to Lily and her parents walk away, he realized that this was what success really meant. Not the sold-out concert hall or the recording contracts or the critical acclaim, but the possibility that his music might encourage someone else to believe in their own dreams. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at his side, still beaming with pride. "So what's next for the famous composer?" she asked with a smile. David thought for a moment, listening to the sounds of the hall emptying around them. "I think I'd like to go home and write some music," he said finally. "I have a lot more stories to tell." As they made their way out of Carnegie Hall and into the bustling streets of New York City, David reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. From that old broken piano in his family's apartment, to the stage of one of the world's most prestigious venues, from the cruel taunts of someone he had once admired to the mentorship that had changed his life forever. But more than anything, he thought about the power of music to transform not just individual lives, but entire perspectives about what was possible. His story wasn't just about a blind boy who learned to play piano. It was about the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances, of recognizing that talent and determination could come from the most unexpected places. As the sounds of the city swirled around him, David smiled and began to hear the rhythms and melodies that would become his next composition. The music was always there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to tell the next chapter of his story.